Global National with Donna Friesen.
The modern Elizabethan era is over. Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in history, has died. And as the news spread today, this rainbow appeared over Buckingham Palace. People are gathered there. Britain is now in a period of national mourning.
Queen Elizabeth II was the rock on which modern Britain was built. Our country has grown and flourished under her reign. Britain is the great country it is today because of her.
And millions across the world share the sadness and are sharing their memories of her.
As her 12th Canadian Prime Minister, I'm having trouble believing that my last sit-down with her was my last. I will so miss those chats. She was thoughtful, wise, curious, helpful, funny, and so much more.
The American President Joe Biden offered his condolences, saying the Queen led always with grace, an unwavering commitment to duty, and the incomparable power of her example. All of her children and her grandson, Prince William, flew to Scotland to be by her side before the palace announced the 96-year-old died peacefully this afternoon at Balmoral Castle, her beloved Scottish home. The crown has now passed to her son, who will be known as King Charles III. In a statement, he called it a moment of the greatest sadness for me and all members of my family. Good evening and thanks for joining us. We all knew she was in the final chapter of her reign. She'd been queen for 7 decades and she'd worked right up until the very end, meeting the UK's new Prime Minister just this past Tuesday. She was always there. And now she is no longer. Tonight, the world is mourning the passing of Her Majesty. Our coverage begins with our Europe Bureau Chief, Goomansingh in London. Crystal.
Donna, yeah, the world really is mourning, and no more sign of that is around the palaces. In London at Buckingham Palace, you saw some pictures a little bit earlier. There's just rows and rows of people, flowers. You know, it's incredibly late here in London, but it is still very, very busy. People just want to come together. They want to be around one another, share stories, and have this sense of community, because truly their sense of community has been rocked. This has been, for most taken away. Now, it's not a matter of shock. She was 96, so people knew that this was going to happen, but it is still profoundly sad, and people are trying to come to grips with it. We did hear from the new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, who just this week was, hand in hand with the Queen as she was asked to form a new government. Here's what she had to say.
Through thick and thin, Queen Elizabeth II provided us with the stability and the strength that we needed. She was the very spirit of Great Britain, and that spirit will endure. She has been our longest ever reigning monarch. It's an extraordinary achievement to have presided with such dignity and grace for 70 years. Her life of service stretched beyond most of our living memories. In return, she was loved and admired by the people in the United Kingdom and all around the world. She has been a personal inspiration to me and to many Britons. Her devotion to duty is an example to us all.
Crystal, Queen Elizabeth took over from her father, George V, and now her son is taking over from her. I guess we have to get used to saying King Charles now. What has the new king said about his mother's death?
Yeah, King Charles, it's definitely different to say, and we're hearing a lot of people now saying, God save the Queen. We expect, based on Reuters reports, that we will hear from King Charles tomorrow, but he did release a statement today, sort of trying to calm the nation and share some thoughts, saying, we mourn profoundly the passing of a cherished sovereign and much-loved mother. I know her loss will be deeply felt throughout the country, the realms, and the Commonwealth. Goes on to say, during during this period of mourning and change, my family and I will be comforted and sustained by our knowledge of the respect and deep affection in which the Queen was so widely held. We can also report that at least one of King Charles's titles has been now handed to Prince William. He will also be known as the Duke of Cornwall, in addition to being called the Duke of Cambridge. Donna?
All right, Crystal Goomansingh in London, thank you. All across Canada, flags on government buildings, including the Peace Tower in Ottawa, have been lowered to half-mast. She was, of course, the Queen of Canada, too. She met so many Canadian prime ministers, so many ordinary Canadians as well on her many trips here. David Akin has been following the Prime Minister, who is in Vancouver. David.
Yeah, that's true, Donna. She had a special relationship with many people, places across the country. I'm in one. I'm standing in Christ Church Cathedral in downtown Vancouver. It's right across the street from the hotel where Justin Trudeau and his cabinet have been meeting for the last 3 days. This is an Anglican church, and it is a church where Elizabeth herself prayed in 1951. She was Princess Elizabeth when she visited then, and in fact, her son, the King, King Charles, he prayed here as well when he visited in 1986. So this cathedral, when the news was announced that the Queen had passed, the doors were open. There's been a book of condolences here that many people have signed, and the church bell tolled 96 times in honor of the memory of Queen Elizabeth. Now, as for the PM and his cabinet, they did conclude their business, their retreat, but by and large, the business of government has been paused as the PM reflected on a queen that he first met for the first time in 1977 as a boy at the side of his dad, Pierre Trudeau.
She was our queen for almost half of Canada's existence. And she had an obvious, deep, and abiding love and affection for Canadians. She served us all with strength and wisdom for 70 years as we grew into the diverse, optimistic, responsible, ambitious, and extraordinary country we are today. In a complicated world, her steady grace and resolve brought comfort and strength to us all. Canada is in mourning. She was one of my favorite people in the world, and I will miss her so.
You know, Donna, Canada has only ever had 23 prime ministers in our entire existence, and more than half of them, 12, including Justin Trudeau, called Elizabeth their queen. Donna?
She has just been around for so long. David Akin in Vancouver, thank you. Well, Canada's 20th Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, had a very special relationship with the Queen that spanned more than 50 years and continued long after he left office. The Right Honourable Jean Chrétien joins me now from Toronto. Mr. Chrétien, you knew the Queen better than most of us. How are you feeling tonight?
Oh, it's a very sad day, but it was expected because she was 96 years old, but I met her in 1967 the first time when she came for the Centennial of Canada, and I had occasion to accompany her in some ceremony, and kept meeting her as minister and as prime minister over the years. I traveled many days in the north for the Centennial of the Northwest Territories in 1970 with Prince Philip, Prince Charles, and Princess Anne with her, and I have a lot of memories, and I met her in Canada many times. I met her in many places in Great Britain. I met her in different Commonwealth countries at Commonwealth meeting. So it's 55 years, well, at least that I know her, and it's a big, big loss for everybody. Millions of people around the globe are very sad at this moment.
You know, so many people have talked about her sense of humor. I'm sure you saw flashes of that over the years.
Oh, but you know, it is well known, for example, that when I signed the Constitution after Trudeau, when I took the pen, the tip of the pen was broken, and when I tried to sign on this very important document. I could not. Pen had been broken. So I said something, and the Queen looked at the left, looked at the right, and burst in a big laugh. And I refused to say to the press what I had said, but eventually I would say that's a state secret, but in fact I had said merde. And she had understood that word because she was perfectly bilingual, and you know, she laughed. And another occasion that was funny, she was one journalist in Quebec had managed to call her pretending that he was Jean Chrétien. And it was a crazy interview, and she was polite. The guy used terrible words, you know, and she kept the dignity that is a characteristic of her personality. But when I met her a few days later in New Zealand, and I said, Your Majesty, I apologize for the incident in Quebec when we are confronted with a very unusual situation. And she said, oh yes, I found that you were not as usual, and I thought you were drunk, she said to me. And just to show how colorful and understanding she was, but she had been trapped by somebody who was quite smart to manage to cheat the Buckingham Palace staff to pretend that she was talking with her Prime Minister of Canada.
Well, thank you for sharing those memories. I'm sure you have.
She was very knowledgeable and very, you know, it was always, she was very interested in what was going on in Canada. Yeah. You know, as I lived some difficult time on national unity, it was a subject that many, many times I discussed with her, and she was offering her support for a strong, united Canada all the time.
Well, former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, thank you so much for sharing your memories and your time with us.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you very much.
Within moments of the announcement of the Queen's death, a crowd began to gather outside Buckingham Palace, thousands of people coming together to say goodbye to the only monarch many of them have ever known. Redmond Shannon is there for us tonight.
Well, Donna, it's late in the evening here in London now, but still people are here at Buckingham Palace. I would estimate maybe a couple of thousand. Of course, the world's media gathering here too, but people just want somewhere to come, somewhere to share, somewhere to talk, somewhere to express their sorrow and their grief. Although it was expected, given the news we heard earlier today, people are still in shock here in London. And when I was out with a camera earlier today, people came up to me, they saw the Canadian flag on my camera, and they said, we want to tell you how we feel. Here's what a couple of them said to me.
She was part of my life. I'm 63, and I remember the Queen when I was, I think, from a child, and what a wonderful, beautiful, lovely Queen she was. What a great spirit.
We've always been brought up with a Queen, you know. God save the Queen, isn't it? That's the saying, the British saying. So kind of takes the great out of Great Britain.
There are now, Donna, some people who've come out of the pubs, and it is a little rowdier, shall we say it, a little noisier here by Buckingham Palace. But earlier we saw something more solemn with London's famous black cabbies parking here, and a procession of those black cabs lined up the Mall, the road that leads up to Buckingham Palace. What a week it's been for this country, with a new Prime Minister and now a new monarch, King Charles III. It will be quite a few weeks ahead. Donna?
Huge changes in the UK. Redmond Shannon, thanks. In June, the Queen celebrated her Platinum Jubilee, marking her 70 years on the throne. We're back with more on her death and her legacy in a moment. The Queen traveled to more than 100 countries, and the place she visited the most was Canada. She did 22 royal tours here, covered vast territory in this country, and met all kinds of people. Eric Sorenson joins me from Toronto. Eric, the Queen made so many connections here. Tell us more about those.
Well, Donna, the Queen's reign spanned 12 of the 23 prime ministers in the history of this country, so more than half since the beginning of Confederation. So it's quite a record that she had with almost half of the more than half of the prime ministers in the country. The first, of course, was Louis Saint Laurent, starting in 1952. He met with the Queen in a formal picture. That's him directly to her left, and there's Winston Churchill right on her right. So it shows you how far back this goes. John Diefenbaker was next. He loved the traditional symbols of British rule in Canada, so much so that he wanted to retain the red ensign with the emblem of the Union Jack as our flag. It was Lester Pearson, of course, who brought in the new red maple leaf flag, and he welcomed the Queen for Canada's 100th birthday at Expo 67. Canadians celebrated being a nation unto themselves long before, of course, there was proper recognition of Indigenous people in this country. Pierre Trudeau met the Queen with young children, including Justin, in the 1970s. And with the Queen, Trudeau signed the Constitution Act in 1982, establishing rights and freedoms that continue to define our values and who we are. Joe Clark wasn't in office long enough to meet the Queen, but he was an opposition leader when he met her, in this picture here. John Turner was only in office briefly. His connection was to Princess Margaret. They were an item, and it was thought they might marry way back in around 1960. Brian Mulroney had a unique relationship. He was a leading force to sanction South Africa to end apartheid. He did not have the full support of UK Prime Minister Thatcher or US President Reagan, though they opposed apartheid, but he had the strong and quiet support of the Queen. Mulroney credits Queen Elizabeth for helping to free South Africa and Nelson Mandela. Kim Campbell did not have a royal visit while in office. That was a quick turnover of 3 prime ministers in that one year, 1993. Jean Chrétien and the Queen got on well, as he was telling you earlier, Donna, that wonderful anecdote with the Quebec prankster and the Queen ultimately telling him she thought it was him on the phone and thought he was drunk, and they laughed about that. Paul Martin met with the Queen in 2005. Of course, his father, Paul Martin Sr., also met with the Queen way back when he was External Affairs Minister. Prime Minister Harper met with the Queen both at Buckingham Palace and in Canada. One thing they shared was a love of the Canadian North. Both made more than one trip to the Arctic. And Justin Trudeau said the Queen was one of his favorite people. We heard him earlier. A sincere sentiment, as he has known her almost all of his life. And here you see the picture. The Queen is wearing a dress with blue and yellow, and the flowers behind her are blue and yellow. And that seemed to be a clear signal just after the war in Ukraine had begun that she was wearing and showing the colors of that country. And the Queen, of course, never betrayed a political position, but maybe just that once she did there. So the Queen met most of the 12 prime ministers who served under her in Canada, Donna, and she really had a warm relationship with all of them and with Canadians.
You know, I heard, Eric, from one royal watcher that Jean Chrétien was her favorite Canadian prime minister. I have no idea if that's true, but apparently because of his sense of humor, and she loved to laugh. Eric in Toronto, thanks so much. She was the matriarch of the UK and in many ways to the whole world. No other person on the world stage alive today can come close to matching her longevity and the vast number of historic events she's witnessed. Warm tributes are pouring in from leaders across the political spectrum. Abigail Beeman is with me from Ottawa with a look at some of that. Abigail.
Well, Donna, we're hearing from Canadian leaders who had a front seat to both pivotal and private moments with the Queen, beginning with former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, in office just 4 days before he hosted her on a visit to Canada.
She was resolute and determined, very engaging, quite lovely, and very kind. She was a towering figure in history.
A decade later, Paul Martin became the 10th of 12 prime ministers during the Queen's reign and remembers her unmistakable affection for Canada, as well as her touching ability to build relationships, noting at their first meeting, she mentioned her friendship with Martin's parents who lived in London, while Mr. Martin Sr. served as High Commissioner in the 1960s. Governor General Mary Simon touched on a few important themes in her message, noting the Queen's belief in service to her people above all and dedication to the Crown, as well as the fact she's the only Queen most people ever knew. Tributes continue to pour in from so many with both historic and personal connections, remembering the Queen's affection for Canada, humility, wisdom, and sense of humor. Donna?
All right, Abigail Beeman in Ottawa, thank you. We're back with more on the death of the Queen in a moment. Queen Elizabeth was 96 years old. She worked right up until the very end, seeing in the UK's new Prime Minister just back on Tuesday. An entire generation has known no other Queen of England. It's impossible to condense her long life into just a few minutes. But Jeff Semple has this look at some pivotal moments.
In an ever-changing world, she was a rock of stability. Queen Elizabeth II famously said she had to be seen to be believed. And over 7 decades, with each passing milestone, thousands turned out to see Britain's oldest, longest reigning, and most beloved monarch.
She's probably the most famous woman in the world, probably the most admired woman in the world.
Her reign was as long as it was unexpected. Born Elizabeth Alexandra Mary on April 21st, 1926, she was still a child when her uncle, King Edward VIII, abdicated the throne. Suddenly, Elizabeth's father was king, and she was next in line. The young princess made this promise.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service.
That devotion to duty would be her hallmark. She was a teenager when Europe went to war and begged her father to let her help, first with her wartime radio broadcasts.
Thousands of you in this country have had to leave your homes and be separated from your fathers and mothers. My sister Margaret Rose and I feel so much for you.
And later, joining the services as a driver and mechanic. During the war, she had a chance encounter with her distant cousin, Philip. He was serving with the British Royal Navy in the Mediterranean and Pacific. They exchanged letters for 7 years.
As onto the famous balcony came the bride and bridegroom.
The newlyweds never expected Princess Elizabeth was about to become queen. But when Elizabeth's father died from a heart attack, the 25-year-old was thrust onto the throne. Her coronation was one of the first televised public events. The young queen quickly showed a knack for protecting tradition while embracing change.
I very much hope that this new medium will make my Christmas message more personal and direct.
But the rise of technology also meant the world was shrinking, and so too was her empire. More than 25 countries declared independence during her reign. Others loosened their ties, like Canada, signing its constitution in 1982. Her reign spanned 14 British and 12 Canadian prime ministers, from Pierre Trudeau's famous pirouette to Canada's second Prime Minister Trudeau.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister of Canada, for making me feel so old.
Many credit the Queen's personal popularity for the monarchy's survival, but at times she struggled to hold the family together. 3 of her children divorced. And after the death of Princess Diana in 1997, the Queen faced criticism for failing to join the public outpouring of grief. In February 2020, Diana's youngest son, Prince Harry, and his wife Meghan retired from royal duties, dealing a blow to the palace. And a couple of months later, the royal family lost another member. Prince Philip died peacefully at Windsor Castle at the age of 99. At his funeral, a scaled-down affair in the COVID-19 pandemic, the Queen sat alone in the pew, a widow after 73 years of marriage. But within days of her husband's death, Her Majesty was back to work, holding virtual royal audiences due to the pandemic, and as always, keeping calm and carrying on. One of the last times the family appeared all together was to mark her Platinum Jubilee, celebrating 70 years on the throne. And despite scandals surrounding some of her children, grandchildren, even the British Prime Minister, the Queen, as ever, seemed to rise above, making a surprise appearance on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. Her legacy will endure, but for a woman who steered the royal family through 3/4 of a century, it's hard to imagine this place without her.
That is Global National for this Thursday. I'm Donna Friesen. We leave you tonight with more moments from Britain as the country and the rest of the world mourn the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. She endured for 70 years, was there at times of great crisis, and great celebration, and it's unlikely the monarchy will be the same without her. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.